let's talk about databases. Quick disclaimer before I begin talking randomly is that this is going to be more of a free talk video. I don't really have a script. I'm just talking from what I can remember from a Reddit thread, from what comes to my mind, from what I feel like talking. I'm gonna keep it informative. I'm gonna try to keep it like that. And if you like this kind of video, do tell me in the comment section and do like the video and stuff like that. In my devlog video, I talked about how I made some changes to my database for the game. And previously, I had all my databases for items, units, encounters, traps, obstacles, spells. Everything was in the form of JSON files. So when the game starts, the game loads all of those JSON files into the memory of the game into actual objects, which are hex classes. And recently I transitioned from that into writing the databases directly into code. Now, why I did that is because I needed a way to write functions inside the code. So my databases basically look exactly the same as they did in the JSONs, except now they're in hex syntax, which is super similar to JSON anyway. But the advantage to writing them directly in code is I can write functions. I can have key, and as a value I can have a function. For example, previously I had some trouble making traps because I wanted traps to have all sorts of weird effects. Right, when you step on the trap, what happens? You can take some damage, you can get a buff, maybe something else can happen. And that is the problem with JSONs. You cannot write functions. In JSONs hold only data. So in hex I could write a function, so when you step on the trap, the game is going to execute that function. There are pros and cons to having your database as a JSON, and there are pros and cons to having your database in code. The Reddit game dev community was kind enough to help me spread out a discussion about exactly this topic, and I have linked the discussion down below. JSON databases or databases in. The first obvious difference between these two is that when you write databases in code, the database is going to be loaded at compile time, meaning when you actually compile the game. And when you have the databases as JSON files, the databases are going to be loaded at runtime, right? When the game starts, when you double click on the game's icon, that's when the databases are probably going to be loaded. The pros of loading the databases from a JSON at runtime when the game starts are that, well, you can modify those databases in between launches of the game. You can launch the game, see something isn't working properly, something maybe it's too strong, maybe there's an item that's too strong, maybe there's an enemy that's too weak. You want to tweak that, quickly modify the database, relaunch the game, and just like that, it's gonna work. This is not gonna work in code, because when the database is created, like at compile time, that's how the database gets loaded every time you open up the game. So if you need to change something in the database, if you need to change some items, enemies, you're gonna have to recompile the whole game, and that takes time. For example, my game takes about 2 to maybe sometimes 3 minutes to compile to Flash. So if you're compiling to Java, ooh, you're gonna have a hard. On the other hand, writing your databases into code is a lot faster at runtime, because when you start the game, the databases are already gonna be there. That way, the game is going to start up fast, and this is probably going to contribute to the user experience of players, right? A faster game loading is always good. You can't go wrong with that. But I think the best advantage for writing the database into code is that you can write functions and custom data types, which you cannot do in JSONs. So if you want to write code into JSON, you're gonna need a secondary programming scripting language such as Lua, or the language I made myself. As I explained with the trap example, if you want to program stuff inside the JSON database, you're gonna need a secondary interpreted programming language. Now most languages with which you make games, such as C#, C++, Java, Hex, these are not interpreted languages, meaning that when you compile the game, that code that you type, it does not exist like you wrote it inside the game. It gets transformed into way more optimized code. The names of variables are lost, the names of functions are lost, so you could not just write code. So you could not just execute code at runtime. If you have a console and you type console.log or trace or system.out.println or console.debug, whatever function you're using for typing, This is not gonna work because the game, the application, the compiled program is not gonna know what console.log is, because inside it, it's gonna be represented as a series of bytes. Therefore, you cannot type code into JSONs. A way you could do that is to have a secondary programming language, such as Lua, Python, JavaScript, something interpreted, some language that can run inside another language. And yeah, if you guess that it sounds complicated, that's because it is. There's a lot to talk about if we're talking about interpreted and compiled languages, but I'm gonna keep that for another video. There's another problem that arises if you wanna write your databases as code. It's translations. What do you do if you want to translate the game into another language? If you had your database as a JSON, you could just create multiple versions of this JSON and swap out the names of items, names of enemies, descriptions of things into another language. Instead of sword, you might have sabir. Instead of dog, you might have sabaka. Instead of blacksmith, you might have forgisto. So yeah, translating the game is gonna be quite straightforward if you want to have JSONs. Now, if you have code, now that's a lot more complicated, because you cannot just choose which part of the code to load. When you have the JSONs, you can choose at the runtime which JSONs you want to load. You can load the JSON in Romanian, you can load the JSON in French, or you can load the JSON in English. There's only one of those is going to be loaded into the game. Now, if you want to write your database into code, you cannot do that, because by nature the game just compiles all of it. You can't have a separate code for English, separate code for Romanian, separate code for French. If you want to do this exactly like you do it with JSONs, you're gonna have like 6, 7, 9, 8 objects which look exactly the same in code. Plus, they're gonna occupy like 6, 7, 9, 8 times more in-game memory, which is not something you usually want. How do you fix this? Well, you can fix this with an idea. I also had a discussion on Reddit, not as productive as the other one, but what you can do is have JSONs with translations, right? Each word, each sentence, you're gonna have a key and a translation in that language. So when the game is compiled, yeah, the database is loaded in English. Let's say by default you make the game in English, so that database is loaded into the game as English, right? When the game actually starts, like at runtime, the game is also gonna read a JSON file with translations from English to Esperanto, or from English to Romanian, from English to Gaelic. And now, yeah, there are problems with this approach. If you wanna see the whole thread and the whole discussion, it's out in the description. But you know, a solution for this is to not have your database in English in the first place. Have small, short identifiers like IDs. Like instead of saying Mr. Bob the blacksmith, you're gonna have blacksmith underscore name, and that's gonna have a translation in all languages. Honestly, I don't like it. But there are many games that have the databases loaded at compile time. You know, the database is written in code. For example, Stardew Valley. I once saw a Reddit thread about how Stardew Valley, the database, is completely... It's basically, the way I saw it, it was written in one single file. Everything was one single C#. And yeah, now, I'm not criticizing it. Stardew Valley is absolutely an amazing game, but I'm just saying, hey, if you're writing code in Unity using C#, I think you have all the reasons in the world to write it in code, because C# integration with JSON is terrible. So yeah, basically that's been my talk about databases and JSONs and non-JSONs, and as also worth checking out YAML, which is like JSONs but without curly braces and quotes. Who needs those? There's also XML, which is terrible. Yeah, if you're loading stuff externally, you might want to stick with JSONs. Or alternatively, if your game is super large, you might want to have an actual database management system with SQL and Elasticsearch and that sort of stuff. Right, basically that's been my talk. That has been all of my talk. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed my random freestyle, free speech, freestyle, programmer, dev lives matter. Subscribe, follow, share, and I'll see you in the next video.